Good morning. This morning I'm with a friend who needs no introduction. Wandile, who is a renowned economist, an author, an academic, and a man who is well known to all of us as he forwards policy in agriculture today. So it's a pleasure for me to be together with Wandile, and welcome, Wandile, that we can have this conversation.
Thank you so much, Terry. We have been threatening to sit down and talk about our sector, the books and everything. So I'm glad that we actually got this moment. Thank you.
Yeah. No, and where I wanted to start our conversation today is our region of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is one of those regions that remains capable of being a huge producer of food, especially when globally food security is becoming a challenge. I just want to start the conversation on your thoughts around sub-Saharan Africa being that breadbasket for global food production.
I think that's a place that we really aspire to get to, Terry, because we're not only now sitting at a place where we are facing food insecurity. I would even categorize it and say you have two challenges. Whenever there are either floods or any natural disasters, we are one region that is most exposed on that. So on any shocks, either trade-related or environmentally, because of the efforts that we are not making to actually get to that potential. The second aspect is also the annual spending that we make. Because, I mean, the overall African continent spends plus or minus $80 billion importing food annually. But the sub-Saharan Africa region, when you take off the Maghreb region, we are spending roughly around $50–55 billion importing food. But then again, to the land capabilities, rainfall, I think we should be on the opposite side where we are earning that $50 billion exporting food. And I think that's where all of us we need to get to. A number of challenges along the way, but I think we must be there.
You speak about the amount that we are dependent on importing food, and it's a significant part of various nations' budgets in sub-Saharan Africa. Why have we not got there? What's held us back?
I think there's a number of reasons on what hold us back, but we can learn from some of the practical examples. Take our own country, South Africa. We are sitting at a position now where we are net exporters, close to $14 billion of agricultural exports each year. So the region, while net importer as a whole, but you do have those spots of sunshine like South Africa. Then the question is, what is it that South Africa is doing differently relative to major parts of the African continent? And I think the differences come both inside of policy as well as a private sector activity. In the African continent, one of the weakest spots for a number of countries is the fact that we have weak land tenure. About 80% or so of rural land in the African continent has no strong tenure. While in South Africa, if you look at it, a greater part of our country actually have strong property rights. We will get to the discussion about all other South African land-related matters. And the second aspect is infrastructure. South Africa, yes, we face ports, roads, and every challenges in our railway line, but I think compared to the continent, that lack of infrastructure becomes an issue. Fragmentation of value chain, agribusinesses not really attracted to get into some of these areas, and I think we need to resolve that. But on a policy side, this idea where whenever there are droughts, governments jump in and block exports and all of those things, I think it creates unpredictability. And I think if we can iron those out and then begin mobilizing investments, progressively we can begin to see the landscape changing.
That's a really interesting perspective. And I think on that note, it brings us to your second book, The Country of Two Agricultures. And I found it really interesting in your introduction, you speak of this being your noble cause to bring a full utilization of agriculture into our region, into our country. Do you want to talk about that noble cause?
I mean, I think, Terry, it links actually to this conversation we're having, contrasting the African continent against South Africa in a sense that South Africa is not all sunshine. In fact, I would say we have a certain part of our farming sector that looks like much of what we see in the greater continent, weak land tenure or governance, infrastructure also not in order, and leading now to this agricultural side that is not flourishing as it should. That's the smallholder farming side of South Africa. Then you have the large-scale commercial farming, which mirrors what I've just explained about the overall country. But I think the dilemma then that South Africa sits in is also the fact that these typologies of farms, because of the history of the country, also gets to have a racial dynamic on it. And I think that you want to focus on closing that dualism because of the risks that are both political and social. Not that we will all have large-scale commercial farming, but I think a better progress in both sides is actually there. But I think at the core, which is to your point about what's that noble cause, I mean, think about our home province, the Eastern Cape. The key thing that we struggle with, you'll agree, is high unemployment. Ourselves and Limpopo are sitting at the top when it comes to poverty statistics in the country. The key question then is, how do you unlock that agricultural production of the Eastern Cape? And how do firms like yours at Chemuniqué and the others bring nutrition and some of the genetics and some of the required interventions to unlock the value of the livestock of the Eastern Cape to an extent that at some extent it begins to come more robustly in the value chain. And I think in the process of that, the economic activity and the job issues begin to be resolved. And I think the book then is a call on agribusinesses and the others to try to work with us in resolving those.
That's good. And you speak about our home province, the Eastern Cape. And when we look at that agricultural potential in the region, and I think your book describes exactly what we see there. We have massive areas of unproductive land coming out of the former homelands, the independent states that we had in the past. And then we've got highly productive commercial farms running next to each other. Are you going to go back into the conversation then where land tenure or secure land tenure is present in some areas and not in others? Do you want to comment on that?
I mean, I think what we are essentially doing now, perhaps we are not keeping up with the promise that is there. Because what is the promise of South Africa is that you have a strong property right, and then you proceed with land reform. But when we think about land reform, we always view it in an aspect of saying, how do you distribute more land so that the Black South Africans have access into the land, which is only just one pillar of that land reform. Because our land reform policy is in 3 branches. It's land redistribution, which deals with these inequities in terms of the access to land. It's a land tenure, which deals with the questions of people who are dispossessed in certain land, and then that land can either be bought in the market or the state compensate them for that. But the one that we are failing and making no progress is land tenure part, which is a 3rd leg of land reform. And that deals with the issue of strengthening people's rights. I would argue that today, as we sit, we haven't strengthened the land rights of people that are in parts of KZN in the former homelands, the land rights of people that are in the former Transkei, in parts of the Northwest and all of that. And I think that's the one aspect that we need to move into. And then I think then once we do that, and of course, the complexities of communal land is very difficult terrain. You cannot just go, I've heard arguments where people say, go to the whole Transkei and apply title deeds. It won't necessarily work in that way, but we will remain with a mixed tenure system. But I think the goal and the progress that we should moving on is in strengthening that land rights. Then after that, the areas that we know that are for agriculture, we begin then to say, how do you work with organized agriculture, with agribusinesses and the others, and ensure that those areas are in full production?
I think that point that you bring out and the areas that have remained unproductive, it brings us to the real elephant in the room, is the Expropriation Without Compensation Act that has been passed. We've spoken at length about poor land security and land tenure, or weak land tenure. Does this not weaken it further?
I mean, I think, Terry, even before we get there, we have to appreciate the fact that between 2006 up until end of 2024, the South African government has been buying land in the open market. And that today, in our estimation on work with Johan Kirsten, is that it's sitting at about 2.5 million hectares of that land. And just for the viewers of our conversation to appreciate how big is that is, all of our grains and oilseeds are planted in about 4.5 million hectares of land. So you have over half of that. The reason then that land today, even itself, is not as full production is because it is leased to a range of black farmers, some of it, and they are given 3-year, 5-year, 30-year leases. No serious investment studies going on, starved of capital. In essence then, ending up looking like the other parts of the land that we need to resolve. So that's the potential at which then we should be moving on in growing the South African agricultural pie. But again, in the aspect of the Expropriation Act then, I would argue that this is not weakening the tenure in South Africa at all. In part because the country is not introducing a new law. We've had Expropriation Act in South Africa since 1975. And what has happened now is to make sure that there are these amendments that are necessary to align it with the Constitution. And of course, the biggest talking theme since the start of the year has been this aspect that there's a possibility of a nil compensation. But that nil compensation is not something that the government bureaucrats or the ministers and the others arrive at. It is a possibility that the courts may arrive at after having considered a whole range of aspects to get to that. And I think, though, the critical thing is that the Expropriation Act is not a tool of driving land reform per se, as even the political leaders have made that particular point. It is administered on public works. Land reform remains on those three principles of redistribution, restitution and tenure, and buying all of that land in the open market. So I think the property rights side in South Africa are still pretty much intact.
So what you're saying is controlled by the judiciary?
The judiciary would arrive at in that. But I think the even more important aspect is that the act on itself would be used as a last resort in a few instances. It's not an act that you would say, okay, I have an expropriation act, I will go drive land reform. And I know that there are political leaders who have said that, and it sparks all of the fears in society, which is something that they themselves misinterpret what's going on. And I think they are adding into this confusion that is out there in the country. And the biggest mistake here, Terry, is actually been done by the presidency and the others that are in government. There should have been clear communication of what's going on. And not leave it to the confusion. Because where all of the confusion starts from, I think, at the end of 2017, we had that ANC conference where one of the resolution was the amendment of Section 25,
yes,
leading to expropriation without compensation. The country had a big discussion, but the agreement was that we do not, as South Africa, we value property rights. It's at the core of our economic growth and all of the things. And we want black farmers to actually also get in and have strong property rights and prosper as we grow the country. And I think now, then, the Expropriation Act, there may be an element of society that confuses both of these two things. And that lack of communication from the leadership at the start of all of this process may have added to this.
How then do we take it to the next step, where you've got this large tracts of land that government have bought for redistribution, to achieve the level of security of tenure for the new owners and the new users of that land? What's the process?
I mean, I think this gets to one of the conversation that you and I and some of our colleagues have had, which is the story that if you look at the South African agriculture and you say, okay, what's the inclusivity level across all crops? Of course, the livestock is one of those that we all pride ourselves with, largely inclusive. You have over a third or so of cattle with black farmers. The question of whether they are at the commercial level or not rests on where I think some of the organizations like Chemuniqué and the others can help in nutrition and genetics and the other things. But then overall, though, when you're not only sticking to livestock, and you bring all of the 36 major commodities that we have at a commercial level, the number drops to 10%, at least in the latest estimations that we have, of the black farmer contribution at a commercial level. But then you take that against the land reform process. There's this narrative in South Africa that land reform is not progressing, but it's actually at 25% of the 30% initial target by the government, which now has been moved to 2030. But then how do you square in the 25% against the 10% commercial production? Is only because much of the land has never been transferred back to farmers, but is sitting with the state. Then to your question of how do we get through that, I think we have to release the land with title deeds and make sure then that we select appropriate beneficiaries. The skills and training is there. The blended finance and other instruments are there, but also the openness of working with private sector, which is what the master plan was at the heart of saying we must do. And not spend a lot of time talking, but really now begin to make things happen.
On that note, Wandile, is there sufficient political will to actually start issuing those title deeds? Because that would require a policy that seems to be contrary to the thinking of a lot of our officials.
I mean, what I can say here, Terry, and I guess I can even wear my hat from the Presidential Economic Advisory Council to say, my understanding of the leadership is that they want the land to actually be transferred to black farmers. The president has said that several times, and that's the idea that even when Minister Titiza, now Speaker, when she was Minister of Agriculture, was speaking on those. And I think what's important about today is that even now, new leadership at the Department of Agriculture, Minister John Steenhuisen, has talked about his commitments to the master plan. The key thing then that is necessary now is for the DG working with the officials to accelerate that process. I know that he is already hard at it and working on that process, so it needs to be accelerated. I think through that, we can begin then to close the dualism to a certain extent. But I think at the core, Terry, which is the most important thing, I think we have to continuously emphasize that the land reform in South Africa has to attain two objectives. One is restorative justice, but the second one is economic growth. If you are not addressing economic growth and you are only moving on restorative justice, then you are not making the nation better off. And I think that it's a key balance of nimbling on both. And in the book, A Country of Two Agricultures, we grapple with that and putting out some of the possible policy actions and programs.
And that is the core of your noble cause you refer to in the book.
Absolutely. That's the noble cause of saying, how do you begin to bring economic growth in rural South Africa through agriculture?
As we come to the end of this conversation, I look forward to the next one coming, where we can discuss your next book, Wandile, that covers a lot of the areas of the structural requirements in agriculture and the associations that govern agriculture. So I look forward to that next discussion.